Hello everybody, and welcome to my spiritual guide to the Rook Ending. And what I want to do in this video is just capture the moment where I feel I got it. If I were a Christian, it would be my come to Jesus moment about what is going on in the Rook Ending. And I might end up doing more complex videos about the Rook Ending, but I really wanted to do this one to begin to just give a framework about how to approach the Rook Ending that I think applies to almost all positions. And that is this: to orient yourself on both the Philidor and the Lucena position. You're going to be in time pressure, you're going to be tired, and you want to basically forget about everything else and just try to imagine the Philidor and the Lucena. And what do I mean by that? Well, with the Philidor, this is black to move and draw. The king, the defending king, gets to blockade the pawn. So right there in all rook endings, your mind should be thinking about the king blockading the pawn. Contrast that to the Lucena position, and here we have the white king shepherding the pawn down the board in communication with the pawn. And when we think about that, it already helps us understand a lot about rook position. For example, the rook should be there to cut the king from the pawn. For example, that's one of the key ideas of the rook in this ending. And I feel it applies to a vast array of positions, and it helps simplify things when they get hectic. And you do need some spiritual guidance at the very end. So, by the way, this position is the first position in my 5-minute rook ending test that you can find on our ChessDojo website. Actually, I'll link it right here. And you can take that to see how you do. And that video is also oriented on the idea that there's really only two fundamental positions, the Philidor and the Lucena. Not that it's bad to learn everything else, but just that those are the foundations. And here's a game that I'm going to show. This is when I come to Jesus moment. I was playing against international master Ben Feingold, now a GM. I was also an IM at this point. And like many of you out there, I was terrible at rook endings and endings in general. And it was only in the years after this that I really spent some time to think deeply about the rook ending and the ending in general. But at this point, I did understand the Philidor. And I had this moment here. Obviously, I'm in incredible pressure in this position. It was white to move, incredible pressure. And I just said to myself, I'm in time pressure. Orient yourself on the Philidor. You are aiming for the Philidor position. And when we look at this crazy position, which is very hard to assess, really the key idea is going to be the rook, the king coming, excuse me, the rook, the king coming to defend, blockade the c pawn over here, because that's the guy that's probably going to be the most dangerous. Okay, let's take a look at how things went. King g4, king h4, check, and now I have to make a decision. The natural move is king g3. If I do play king g3, however, black comes there, and I'm just in big trouble. His king is better than my king. His rook is better than my rook. So this one, I guessed, was close to lost, and I think that's true. So I had to make the incredibly ugly move, king h3. So we then saw king g5, and we get this position. Now, it's easy for me to tell you in hindsight that this position is a draw. During the game, I had no idea. And the reason to be very suspicious about the position for white is mostly to do with the terrible, terrible position of the white king and the possibilities for the black king to come in and shepherd this pawn down the board, Lucena position. So my opponent played, I think, a good move. c5, and we're getting all kinds of scary business going on here. In particular, the question in time pressure, is black threatening king e4? And I decided that he wasn't threatening king e4, and I here make what I think is a very bad move. Now this move, when you turn the engine on or whatever, it still says I'm drawing, but I guarantee you it's totally wrong. By the way, there's a funny thing in this position. To my mind, there's only one correct move. The engine will show, and in fact, I knew that there was another solution as well. But on a practical level, there's only one way to solve this position, play this position. And I feel similarly about this one. I played this ugly-looking move, and one of the things that the Rook Ending has taught me, and by the way, the Rook End game, it's kind of like its own separate game. It's almost like a different kind of chess in that it operates by its own rules. But what it shares with the rest of chess that is very instructive is in other parts of the game, let's say you have 8 pieces, because pawns aren't pieces, you have 8 pieces and one of them's bad, you don't necessarily feel it as much. And what the Rook Endgame teaches you is that you need to feel bad pieces because you only got 2. So if one isn't working, that's half of your force not working effectively. So I played this very sad move, Rook G2, and I would like to believe that now, even though Rook G2 is technically drawing, that now I would have said to myself, right, I've got one bad piece, and that's the king. And the king needs to come over. Now, what prevented me from playing this move is obvious. Of course, I was worried about my pawns getting snatched. But what we see here, very important, is he can take either one. But now my king is coming to the Philidor position. And yeah, he can take either one. This is now going to be a draw. And I'm really threatening rook c7 as well. So maybe king e5, king d3. I'm fine. He can have my pawns. It's not about the pawns. It's about whether the king is blockading his pass pawn. Okay. So I played this ridiculous move. And one of the problems that I think is important to see about the rook and pawn ending is, in general, you never want to calculate a pawn ending. You just don't want to do it if you can avoid it. And what I'm allowing black to do now is to play king e4. Now, hopefully I calculated this, but it's honestly pretty hectic. Because even in this position, I can go terribly wrong. King g3, for example, would be a terrible blunder. It's hard to imagine, not necessarily something you might see straight off. This is honestly still a little bit unpleasant to play for white, but imagine if my king were on g3, then queen c3 would be check and the game would be over. So that's the kind of thing that I'm putting myself now into, let's call it the zone of one mistake, right? One mistake and I'm out. Okay, so Ben played rook d4, and I played correctly rook e2. Cutting the king. So the king, my key defensive priority is the rook has to block the king from coming over. Now I come rook c2, c4. Finally the king comes in. And now I am working correctly toward getting my king over. King e3. And here it's a little terrifying because I'm also potentially going into a pawn ending, but this one I was familiar with, and this is a draw. There's a famous position where the pawn is on a3, and there's a famous Zugzwang in that position, but I knew that pawn on a2 is always going to be fine because there's stalemate tricks with my king going into the corner. Anyways, I can show what that looks like. Right? There's no way for him to actually get at me here. With c2, king c1, king c3, it's going to be a draw. Maybe I should just show that for a second. There's no way for him, even if it were white to move, I can't get out because of the pawn. Okay, so rook d4 was played, rook c3. And here, very important that I'm now just setting up the Philidor position, and it's a fairly easy draw. One thing that, just go back and forth, and I'll just say, many people got the fundamental first position wrong amongst others, and so one of the things it shows me is it really is a different game, the Rook Endgame, and so I want to repeat that you should be kind to yourself with the Rook Endgame. It will probably take a little bit of time and a little bit of effort before it feels natural, and especially the ideas of the Philidor and the Lucena need to come from your fingertips. And maybe I can do more examples in another video. I say the thing about kindness because I was very cruel to myself. I was beating myself up. How come, Kraai, you can't get this right? Blah, 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 blah. And the Rook Endgames, especially in the more complicated positions, can be very difficult. Some of the most difficult endings there are out there. But especially in today's modern chess, where you generally have a 30-second increment, if that, you're going to need a spiritual guide. That is just an idea of what the basic places for the pieces should be so that your hand can make a lot of the moves and not just your mind. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.